Silksong has been met with very mixed reception, and that extends just as much to its bosses. It's a roster of twists and turns, from beloved fights like Lace to those the community despises like the savage beastfly. Today I'll be throwing my hat into the mix and giving you my thoughts on the best and worst bosses of this game. The fact any boss managed to surpass the savage beastfly at the bottom of the list is a shock to me, but Grol the Great is one of the single worst bosses I've ever fought in a video game. It kicks off with multiple waves of annoying enemies in an arena which poses a very real threat of inflicting you with poison, which is just a terrible status effect in this game. Then the fight against the boss ensues, and he doesn't have a single good move. There's basically no way to predict where his toxic bombs are gonna go, his breath attack just stalls the fight and presents no real threat. Worst of all, he's a flying enemy who have some really janky movements in this game. Pair that with the utterly obnoxious 2-mass contact damage and you have a recipe for a terrible boss. But the fact you have to beat the waves of enemies every time after an already annoying run back should be considered a war crime. In fact, I'm sure this entire fight violates multiple policies of the Geneva Convention. And they've done it again. They made yet another gank worse than the savage beastfly. Let's look at the potent similarities between the Broodmother and Grol. They both force the players to go through waves of annoying enemies, many of which are flying bugs, before fighting the boss. At least here Team Cherry had the good sense to put a bench outside the boss arena, almost like they realised they'd made an awful boss. The Broodmother's moveset is terrible. She uses the incredibly annoying gunk spit that the other enemies in the slab use, stopping your movement for a few seconds. This can lead to a loop where you get stuck in constant gunk and makes damage impossible to avoid, a cardinal sin we'll see committed by multiple bosses on this list. She also has the ability to summon flying adds, which do thankfully get one shot, but can often be frustrating to catch, and the explosion that follows when you kill them can force you into, again, situations where damage cannot be avoided. Her dives aren't too bad to avoid in isolation, but it's when she pairs them with her others that they become an awful move. Finally, in phase 2 she steals the power of the Grozmother like she's Aldrich consuming Gwendolyn and starts jankily bouncing around the already too small arena. It wasn't a good move in 2017, it's not a good move now. This boss is just terrible. At least the Savage Beastfly has one kind of passable move, the Broodmother has absolutely nothing positive about it.
I promise this game does have some great bosses, so I'm utterly baffled at the incompetence on display with the design of some of them. Seriously, sometimes Team Cherry make themselves out to be unrivaled masterminds of boss making with those at the top of this list, and then others they concoct abominations like Grol and Broodmother. Are their good bosses just flukes that happen to incorporate important design principles well, without the developers actually understanding what makes them great? The fact they can devise encounters this awful honestly makes me think so. The Unravel kicks off with a wave of enemies as so many bad bosses in this game do, though at least this one isn't all too bad, but making players face multiple throughout was such a misguided choice. Then there's the boss himself, who has a completely atrocious moveset. His projectiles are probably the worst in the game, since there's no way to know whether you'll get the one flying high or low first. When you take damage here, it's completely out of your control, since avoiding this attack is entirely down to luck. Then there's his charge, which is incredibly janky to avoid, and he'll often bounce off the wall and collide with you, dealing 2 hearts of contact damage. Again, a completely idiotic inclusion. But you can't play it safe. Nope, that's your only opening to deal any damage to him, since his metal cap makes him immune to pogos. You'd think we're fighting the Pale Stag with how little opportunity there is to actually harm the boss. It's called a boss fight. We're meant to be fighting the boss, not surviving and waiting until the boss decides to give us a chance to attack. And the cartwheeling enemies he spawns are just so annoying. Furthermore, the spears he summons in phase 2 add absolutely nothing to the fight, and instead lead to occasional situations where damage is impossible to avoid. This boss sucks, and sadly the end of this bottom tier is nowhere in sight.
The fights we've covered so far made me absolutely miserable, and I'm sure they had the same effect on all of you. But you know what definitely wouldn't be considered awful in my books? You subscribing. Maybe leaving a like on this video while you're at it. Trust me, unlike dumping ads into a boss arena, it's actually a brilliant decision. Of course I hate to interrupt the video with this, but the evidence shows that if you don't ask, viewers simply won't do so, and the more support I get on the videos, the more encouraged I feel to put out more boss ranking bangers every week.
This technically isn't a gank fight, but it may as well be. The face and tail have entirely different movesets, yet neither of them are good. Projectiles in this game are consistently very janky, and there's no change to that here. The tail's red orbs bounce around so unpredictably and lead to so much unnecessary damage. The falling bells add nothing to the fight and pose no real threat. The weaving along the ground is at least a better move than everything else, and the rain of red slime the head creates is so annoying and always feels entirely out of your control to avoid. I do appreciate the lore of this boss and the despair it presents when the player realizes they can't warp with the Bell Beast. Unfortunately, its mechanics just suck. For so long, the Savage Beastfly sat at the bottom of this list, so it's disappointing to see it climb so high due to other fights being even more awful. Game developers continue to prove that they're either the dumbest people in the world or the most arrogant. Either they're somehow unaware that mindlessly dumping additional regular enemies in a room with a boss is universally despised design decision that never works, or they're aware of it but think they're going to be the first to shirk the trend. I don't know which is worse, but the Savage Beastfly shirks no trends. The additional enemies ruin the fight here just as much as any other. The only enemies I don't mind are the spiky shells, but that's not to say I'm a fan of their addition. They just aren't nearly as awful as the flying tanks or the charging bugs, both of which are incredibly difficult to deal with. I know there's going to be someone in the comments telling me, you can just use the Beastfly's slams to kill them. I'm aware that that's the most effective strategy. I employed it myself. The issue is, the flying tanks are immune to damage when using their slash flurry attack, and it's incredibly difficult to line up the slam to hit the smaller bugs mid-charge. There were so many times across my mere 5 attempts where I fell into situations that were simply impossible to not take damage in, since the bugs ganked me into a corner and there was nothing in my toolkit that could have got me out of that scenario. Even setting aside the gank, the Beastfly itself has a really bad moveset. The triple slam is serviceable, but it's not exactly riveting gameplay, just sidestepping around it and hitting back once every time. But the boss's other attack, the charges, are some of the most janky moves I've seen in what is for the most part a very polished game. They don't detect the player's position when their tell starts. No, that would be far too logical. Instead, they begin the tell, then a split second later capture the player's location and charge towards it. But it's not like there's any reasonable indication of how to time this. You're essentially just guessing. If you jump even remotely too soon, the fly will lock onto you as you're in the air, and the attack will become impossible to avoid, even though you reasonably should have dodged it. The discourse surrounding this boss online has all been in agreement with my own thoughts. The Savage Beastfly is utter garbage, and the fact we still have to deal with game devs trying this proven awful formula makes me so angry. Oh look, another boss that starts off with a wave of enemies and summons ads. Who'd have thought it would end up near the bottom of the list? The Crawfather itself, like many of these kinds of bosses, evidently hasn't been given the love others like Lace receive. It has a dive and some melee strikes, neither of which are interesting attacks. His final move is actually pretty cool, being the spike chains that he spreads across the arena, but it doesn't exactly redeem his moveset. Even alone, the Big Crow would be underwhelming, but Team Cherry once again felt the need to dump some regular enemies in the room with him, and unfortunately these are some of the most annoying in the game. They're all flying enemies, and they bounce around so jankily in the air that very often they'll gallivant into you and force you to take contact damage. Get used to hearing me complain about idle contact damage in this video. I've got no plans on letting it go. This boss is just terrible. The incompetence of game devs to keep using this style of boss design is almost unbelievable. I have no idea what the developers were thinking designing this fight. It has one attack, only one, which isn't even a good move. It's just a set of projectiles that you have to jump over, not exactly engaging gameplay, and quite often they'll bunch up together and put you into a situation where avoiding the discs is incredibly awkward. Add to this the stag's teleportation and it gets even worse. It's not like in Phantom's fight where it makes the encounter more interesting and enhances the flow. It just furthers the frustration since the stag never stays still. The fight drags on so significantly since you can only ever land one hit at a time. It's just really boring. It's not as annoying as any of the lower bosses, but for such a great area, it's a really annoying fight. I can kind of appreciate Zango. Visually, it's very distinct from everything we've seen before in Hollow Knight, but mechanically, he just doesn't deliver. It's a DPS check, and not a very fun one. His moves aren't interesting to engage with, and when he spams the same one for basically the entire fight, that's a real issue. The charge is also one of the weakest in the game, and given he can unleash it before all his blue orbs have dispersed, it can lead to some situations where it's basically inevitable you're going to get hit by one or the other. The gameplay of this fight just isn't particularly enjoyable, so while I want to like him, I can't force myself to defend this boss.
Ah yes, everyone loves a boss they can't even fight with their primary toolkit. Nihilith's first phase is mediocre but largely inoffensive. The second is what completely ruins the encounter. You basically have no safe windows to deal damage with your needle, so healing in this phase is essentially a pipe dream. The only way you can actually damage her is by knocking her spike balls back at her, but it's entirely dependent on RNG how often she even spawns them. Of course you can resort to your red tools. As usual I'd recommend the Cogflies and Conchfly combo, but what exactly is the player expected to do if they've run out of shards? It doesn't help that the nearest bench costs 15 rosaries to set anyway, and isn't even permanent. It's a complete joke. The orange slime projectiles are incredibly annoying to avoid due to their slight tracking. Her dash can be really difficult to get around at times, and fighting while trying to cling to the wall is just so irritating. Everything surrounding this encounter really just sucks, so while it's not as enraging as fights lower on the list, it just barely makes out of the bottom tier. Lugoli really has nothing positive to his fight. He bombards you with that awful poison mechanic you've already had to suffer in the preceding level, and his attacks fill most of the screen, leaving little room to evade. The poison balls have the janky bouncing physics shared by a couple of other bosses such as Widow and the Bell Beast, making them very difficult to track. Due to this, it's almost inevitable you'll get poisoned at some point in this fight, which makes the entire rest of the fight a complete drag. His belly bounce is boring and covers far too large an area. Basically everything about this fight just isn't good. Definitely deserves to be down here.
This boss has one of the least complex movesets in the game, and frankly I'm thankful for that. If they'd made this fight any less simple, I'm sure it would have suffered the pitfalls of Grohl and the Unraveled. Obviously my placement proves I don't love the fight, but he didn't anger me. He has two attacks to threaten you. The main one to deal with is the spike traps he throws out, which cut down the available space in the arena. Secondly, he has a massive Moss Charger-esque dash, which isn't too dangerous but can catch you if you get blocked off by the traps. I should also make mention of his leaping from the ground, which may as well be considered an attack. As always, I'm not a fan of contact damage, but in this instance it does actually feel like the boss is in the process of attacking, and the leap comes with a clear tell. He really doesn't have a whole lot going for him, but he doesn't do anything truly awful.
I don't understand why it feels like every other boss in this game has ads mindlessly dumped in the arena with them. There's just no need. Signis's moveset isn't terrible, not exactly great, but not awful, but add those stupid bomb-throwing flying dudes to the mix, and it becomes an incredibly poor fight. As if that wasn't enough, he later summons a charging shield fatty as well, and even when you get to phase 2 where the real fight begins, the two bosses' movesets don't gel together in the slightest. There's no metering of their aggression. They just mash buttons at you until you get unlucky and caught with some damage that you couldn't possibly have avoided. Projectile attacks in this game have such broken tracking, it honestly feels like they have aimbot. The spear guy never seems to miss, and having an AoE a second after his spear lands is just so obnoxious. It shuts down the player's freedom to move on an already tiny arena and makes so much damage impossible to avoid. This is just a terribly designed gank, no effort put into their balancing whatsoever, and it's clear to see. What is it with flies in this game? Actually, I shouldn't be surprised. Flies just suck in general. At least the name is accurate, and it's his biggest flaw. The difference in aggression between this fight and the earlier duo is astounding. Of course, any duo boss should have their aggression tempered to account for the multiple enemies, but turning it up to this degree was not a good decision. If they wanted to make him harder, why not just give him some new moves or add a lingering damage area following his dashes? Now that I think about it, the latter would have worked excellently and could have made this a much better fight than the duo, but instead they stuck with the same basic, boring moveset and simply ramped up the numbers. I swear the drill projectile feels like it has aimbot. I know you can hit it away and it will damage the boss, which I do appreciate, but actually doing so isn't quite so easy. I will say in this boss's favour, it uses ads exactly how they should be used. Take note, Savage Beast Fly. It's still not a great inclusion, but the regular enemies don't actually have unique AIs of their own. They're more an extension of the boss's moveset. They take predetermined and predictable actions based on what the main Conchfly does. They're still not an interesting way to expand upon this fight from the duo, but at least they don't drag it down. Regardless, this boss just isn't an enjoyable experience.
To give this boss its props, it's a natural evolution on the first fight against Trubbio. Unfortunately, the way his moveset is expanded only draws the issues of the fight out further. The biggest villain in this placement is the new addition of the exploding orbs, which create diagonal cross patterns, rather than the damage areas only covering the X and Y axis separately. This leads to many more situations where damage is impossible to avoid. There's also the trail of damage areas following the tornado, which while in isolation is a great addition, it once again creates more frequent scenarios where damage cannot be avoided. aside. I'll dive deeper into why Trobio's fights don't work for me when we speak about the original in a moment, but essentially the rematch just makes all my issues with Trobio much more potent.
I don't have too much to say about the Volt Worm. None of his moveset is particularly interesting to engage with, but none of it's at all frustrating or overly awful. His design is fairly bland, there's no neat lore as far as I'm aware of. He's just a nothing burger of a boss. Again, he doesn't frustrate me the way the lower bosses do, but I don't have anything all that positive to say about him. Silksong doesn't really have too many bosses I'd consider gimmicks, but the Flame Father here could fit right in with Demon Souls' boss roster. The area he's placed in is ruined for me by those annoying fireballs, more projectiles that feel like their tracking is way too strong. Then the boss decides that those are going to be his only attack. Even the new move he gets after you break his torches is just even more of them. He reminds me of the Tree of Men from Salt and Sanctuary, probably that game's worst boss. It's a banger though, definitely one I'd recommend every Hollow Knight fan plays since it has a lot of the same strengths, but the Father isn't as bad as that boss. Unfortunately, it still completely fails to provide any form of engaging gameplay or challenge, so he lands on the lower end of the list. I have a sneaking suspicion that people are going to absolutely love this boss. The presentation and visuals are great, no doubt, but the mechanics, not so much. RNG plays such a massive role in this fight that it's just completely tarnished for me. There's no real way to know where his balls are going to bounce, leading to a lot of unnecessary damage, and he can pair his explosive AoEs with his tornado dash, or worse, with the balls. This combo in particular can lead to some plainly unavoidable damage. That's the worst thing a boss can do, force the player into situations where their own mistakes aren't to blame for the damage they take, since it was entirely out of their hands. The smaller tornadoes that burst out from the tornado rush also travel at a very strange angle, making that attack pretty lame to deal with. He's probably the hardest boss in the game to this point, and not all of that feels earned. In fact, most of it doesn't. So while the visual design of this boss is solid, the technical aspects drag it down significantly. This is exactly the style of boss I love, yet this one thoroughly lets me down. My biggest issue is in the visuals of the fight, with the sandstorm making it annoyingly difficult to make out the boss's attacks. It's already tough enough to determine where the hitbox of his weapon actually is. The gusts of sand and dim lighting just make it all the more annoying, not to mention the gravity-defying nature of his overhead slam. It follows you for way longer than it feels like it should be able to. Then there's the grounded melee attacks, where sometimes he'll throw out just one, and you'll miss your opportunity to counter since you are anticipating the triple slash. But if you don't play it safe and expect the triple slash, you'll get caught while going for damage when he does inevitably do it. The boss's moves aren't terrible on a conceptual level, but everything in the execution here just leads to an unbelievably dull gameplay loop of waiting for an attack, running in to hit the boss once, then repeating for the entirety of the fight. It's just not all that fun. This gank fight takes a very easy tutorial boss and makes it an actual challenge. Of course that difficulty does come from the classic gank formula of overwhelming the player, and my biggest complaint with this fight is how much there can be on your screen at any given time. It can become hard to keep track of, but the aggression of the pair is balanced well. It uses the old bell gargoyle trick of having the second enemy spawn later. If the ads they summoned were a little more dangerous, I'm sure this fight would be absolutely awful, but you can cut them down pretty quickly so it doesn't become frustrating. The challenge here really is in being able to keep up with all the different telegraphs you'll be faced with, as if you let one mother slip your vision for a second, you can easily get caught by a dash. It's not my favourite form of challenge, but at least the fight is managed a lot better than you'd expect one of this style to be. The game's first real gank is unfortunately not a great one. It's just boring. The fight really only consists of two moves from the flies, their drills across the screen in all directions, and firing smaller drills that ricochet at you. None of these attacks are threatening, none are really engaging to interact with, it's just a case of waiting, hitting, until the boss dies, which isn't exactly quick either. A bad boss at the end of an awful area. Seriously, why does every bench here have a toll? The fact game developers still refuse to put checkpoints near bosses in 2025 is infinitely frustrating to me. Why do they never learn? Nobody likes ads being dumped in boss fights. It's never a good design decision. Without them, Splinter would actually be a passable fight. Her melee slash is a really well designed move. The bramble walls add an extra layer to the fight and force the player to manage more elements at once, but the ads just completely ruin it. It's not even like they're great enemies themselves. They literally have a single move. Sister Splinter was the first stain on this game's boss roster, and while it's not terrible, I can't bring myself to enjoy it. The Skull Tyrant is a similar case to the Conchfly's, where his simplicity holds him back from being a more riveting boss, but his moves do lend themselves to a much more enjoyable gameplay loop, weaving in dodges to avoid the leap, jumps to evade the dash, and raining projectiles this game seems to love, and they work well here. They're clearly telegraphed, as are all the Tyrant's moves. The ambush in Bone Bottom was also really funny, so points for that. I think he's a fine boss, but just not one I'll really remember or speak highly of. This is certainly the hardest boss players will have faced until this point in the game, due to just how long the fight goes on for in comparison to the other early bosses. His moveset itself is really simple, only comprising of 3 attacks, but the fight evolves as it progresses, and the way you can mix these moves up is much more interesting. I don't have any real issue with these moves in isolation. What drags the fight down for me is that I don't find its attacks all that enjoyable to engage with. They all have very, very similar counters, being to jump and move away from the boss, then get a few attacks in. It's that repeated for 5 minutes because he has so much health. It doesn't engage me all that much, which would be fine for the 5th boss in the first Hollow Knight, but following Lace in the 4th chorus, it's a notable step down. Obviously his placement should be evident. I do think it's a solid boss, but it's not one that makes me think, damn, I really like this. And let's not even talk about how poor that run back is.
I know for sure this is going to be a controversial placement, as I've already seen somebody declare Carmelita the best boss in the game. In fairness, I did rank her OST as my favourite, so that's a point in this boss's favour, but mechanics will always be the most important thing for me, and Carmelitas just aren't my cup of tea. That's not to say I think they're bad. She clearly has a very well considered moveset with natural progression as the fight goes on, but aside from the 3/ melee combo, none of them are all that engaging to me. The gameplay loop gets repetitive after a while, with the player only ever really being able to deliver one hit at a time. There's also the added detriment that Carmelita just loves to jump into you and deal 2 massive contact damage. No, I'm not going to stop complaining about it. I will never stop complaining about idle contact damage. Furthermore, there was no good reason to force players to fight through an enemy room every time they want to face her. It's far from the worst in the game, and the last wave with the 2 guards is actually really fun, but it becomes so tiresome when you just want to fight the boss, but instead you've got to go up against the same enemies you faced too many times to count. I do like Carmelita. She excels in a couple of areas, but there's also a lot holding her back, to the point I just think the other bosses higher on the list are more fun or serve their purpose better.
The Moss Mother is Silksong's introductory boss, and at first glance you think it shares a lot of similarities with the original game's Grub Mother. That's only sort of true. Their simplicity is shared, though the Moss Mother definitely has more to offer. Her moveset isn't nearly as one-dimensional, nor is it as erratic. Her primary move is the dash across the screen, which effectively introduces jumping as a method of avoiding damage. Then there's the falling rocks, which force you to position out of the way. And finally there's our summoning of the regular enemies you'll have faced in the level up until now. Usually I despise when bosses have ads, as I've made abundantly clear in this video, but here I'm surprisingly a fan. The enemies themselves are incredibly easy. The challenge is in being able to deal with them and the boss at the same time. You can kill them very quickly, but you have to be watching for the mother's dash attack at the same time. Of course this boss isn't difficult at all, but it is a very effective introduction to the game's combat systems. Not to the same level as the likes of From Software's classics like Gascoigne, Genichiro, Gundyr, Margit, but effective nonetheless. I personally wish it had a little more complexity, or at least the moves it does have were more threatening, but do I honestly think that would make the fight a better tutorial boss? I'm not sure. It obviously doesn't reach the highs of many other bosses, but it succeeds at what it's trying to do, and I'm grateful for it, so it just about reaches the decent tier despite its simple moveset. Beast isn't exactly what I look for in a boss fight. That said, it does provide a lot of value, and its design is well executed. My biggest issue is the charge attack, since it doesn't provide you much opportunity to counter with your regular attack. I know it's meant to teach you how to use the needle throw and standard slash in unison, but when you get hit a few times enough to use your silk to regain health, you're now left with a move that gives you a very narrow window to counter. The rest of the moves are solid, though there's no way I'm aware of to determine the direction the falling bells will bounce, which I don't love. But overall, I do like the Beast, and it's a solid expansion on the design philosophies introduced by the Moss Mother. Seth should be a good boss. His moves are all very solid. Unfortunately, there's a lot that drags the fight down. A lot of it will be spent unable to damage him due to the shield mechanic, which I'm just not a massive fan of. He also loves jumping into you and dealing unnecessary damage. I appreciate that for once it's not dealing too mass, but idle contact damage just plainly isn't a good mechanic. When the boss is attacking, sure, contact damage is fine, but when they're idly moving around, it's just frustrating. When it becomes difficult to predict Seth's movement, this punishment really doesn't feel all that fair. Phase 2 is a strong enhancement of Phase 1, and I do enjoy engaging with all of Seth's moveset. Unfortunately, when he's not attacking, the issues of the fight become very clear. I think he's going to be a highly popular boss in the community, but for me personally, he falls short of the bosses ahead of him. The Last Judge itself is a pretty well designed fight. It's not incredible, it's just mechanically fine. The jumping attacks are definitely the best it has to offer, especially when they get spiced up with fire in phase 2. The mace swingy AoE is good in phase 1, allowing for a little extra damage if you can time it perfectly, but in phase 2 it just stalls out an already lengthy fight an unnecessary degree. The mace throw and dash attack are both good in isolation, though their tells are just a little too similar for my liking. It's not always entirely clear which you'll have to dodge. A subtle audio cue or twinkle of light surrounding the mace for the throw would have gone a long way. I've seen people complain that the throw will often come from off screen and the telegraph won't be visible, which I saw a couple times for myself, and while I didn't have too many issues, it is a flaw that deserves addressing. But overall, the mechanics are fine. Unfortunately, as I stated when speaking about Sauron in my Dark Souls 2 boss ranking, sometimes the runback is so awful that it can just ruin a boss. Admittedly, this isn't close to as bad as that runback, but when seeking out the community's thoughts on The Last Judge, all the discussion was surrounding that dreadful runback. It's utterly indefensible. I feel like Team Cherry have just been locked away in their studio for the past 8 years, unaware of the evolution that's been happening in these style of games. It's commonplace now for bosses to have checkpoints outside the arena, since game developers have become aware that nobody likes boss runbacks. How did this basic fact fly under their radar? It's some completely ignorant game design that you cannot justify. As I've stated before, in these situations the boss becomes not a fight against the boss itself, but a desperate struggle against having to do the runback. You play worse, make mistakes, and get overly frustrated at the boss because you know death sets you back so far. I pray they just add a bench outside his arena in a future update, because design decisions such as these cannot be allowed to play great games any longer. Yeah, you're seeing that right. I've put the community favourite boss down in the decent tier and nowhere close to the top of the list. I'm sure nobody's going to take that as a personal attack or anything. The final boss of the game essentially strips away all the qualities that make the previous fights against Lace stand out so much to me. I love them for their simple, elegant, refined movesets that never felt dependent on anything but the player's skill to dodge. In this fight, there's a whole host of added elements that ruin that perfect flow. It begins leaning more towards overwhelming bullet hell than measured duel. Due to the way the boss's state machines are managed in this game, they can unleash a second attack while the previous one is still active, provided it's a lingering hitbox like the slashing void masses Lace leaves on the ground. The biggest issue is, her abyss-based attacks blend into the background so much that keeping track of everything becomes incredibly difficult. Lace herself is pushed back while her attacks, like the columns of void tendrils, are brought to the foreground. This results in many an occasion where Lace's movements are obscured by her attacks and the player can't actually see the tell for her next move. If the player can't see a tell, they can't reasonably be expected to avoid the damage. And then we have to watch that issue rear its ugly head again. Contact damage. It's so obnoxious here. Lace should not be damaging the player for colliding with her if she's not in the middle of an attack. The fact that she does means she can teleport into them and deal unavoidable damage, leap into them without sufficient tell for them to avoid that contact damage, or backstep into them while they think they're safe. Idle contact damage is an awful design decision. It becomes even more annoying when you run to avoid an attack and she teleports into your path, blocking your sole route of escape. There's some good to this fight, don't get me wrong. While the narrative and presentation isn't as strong as in the second fight with Lace, the score here is absolutely phenomenal, maybe even better than our original. The newly added projectile attack surprisingly isn't bad. It's probably my favourite of our void based moves and feels incredibly fair to dodge. The original moves are for the most part just as good, and I love the wall of abyss tentacles that serves as the transition to her second phase. I don't love that she uses it during the main part of the fight, as it really harms the pacing mid phase, but for the transition it's cool. Unfortunately, despite all the good, and despite me having some fun with the challenge Lace provides, there's just so many flaws with the design here that massively detract from everything that made the earlier fights so great. I appreciate this boss being much harder than any other in the game. Clearly I still enjoy the fight, I just don't think it's as good as everyone else is claiming. She's vastly inferior to the rematch at the end of Act 2, and while I know it will be controversial, I have no issue placing the true final boss a little lower on the list. Widow's moveset has all the makings of a great one, but it doesn't quite execute it as well as it could have done. The bulk of my issues stem from phase 2, which just sees far too much on screen, making it very difficult to keep track of all the attacks. Worse is Widow's tendency to retreat to the edge of the room and vanish from view entirely, which can be incredibly frustrating when she whips out the slashing dash without you being able to see the telegraph for it. But aside from those few gripes, Widow is very solid. The projectiles raining from above are really good yet again. The diagonal bell tosses are great in phase 1, and her melee rush is actually really well handled. I like Widow overall, but there's enough holding her back from being in the higher tiers. I initially wasn't a fan of this fight, since I don't particularly enjoy the void attacks used by many of the enemies in Act 3. I just found the fan of projectiles he shoots in front of him really annoying, but my opinion on this fight massively changed when I realised the best strategy was to dash towards him and pogo on his head, since this attack only hits to one side of him. With this strategy adopted, I began to really enjoy the fight. His melee thrusts are a solid move, though I do think the delay on that third attack is a little too long and makes it feel a little unnatural. The slam to the ground dispersing black sludge is once again best handled with pogoing, and I actually like the masses of slashing void limbs in this instance. I think Garmond's mechanics are really strong, and the presentation of the fight is great. Zaza leading you to him is an incredible bit of build up, and finding one of your closest allies consumed by the void makes the emotional stakes of this fight higher than most others in the game. While at first I didn't appreciate Garmond, now he just barely misses out on the good tier. While I'd prefer to forget about the gauntlet of consecutive enemy rooms preceding this boss, Khan himself is pretty great. Phase 1 introduces his primary attack, the coral columns that cross the arena in varying directions. It's definitely my favourite part of the fight, and creates a nice challenge of both positioning and reaction to maximise your damage output. Phase 2 introduces a couple of new moves. The darts that cross the arena vertically is a really good move, but the stationary coral spikes he spawns on the floor and roof of the arena aren't my cup of tea. I'm rarely fond of the player's freedom of movement being restricted, and that's no different here. That same problem always arises. The player can be forced into situations where damage is impossible to avoid. That's a rarity in this fight, and the rest of the mechanics are really good, so Khan definitely still holds up. The visual design is also excellent, with the sands of Karak, particularly the Coral Tower, being one of the best looking areas in the game. But there's a larger problem with this boss. Much like Carmelita, the player is forced to go through an enemy room before they can challenge him. It's just annoying. There's nothing positive about this design decision, and this room is much more annoying than the one before Carmelita. Still not hugely challenging, but it's just added frustration where it really wasn't necessary. Khan is a really solid encounter. There's just a few elements holding the fight back.
The Pinstress is a pretty solid encounter, one you'd think I'd love. While I'm a massive fan of the melee attacks she can throw out, as usual I made an effort to fight her with the parry and it made it much more fun. The fan of blades she throws isn't my favourite move to interact with. Maybe there's a strategy I didn't figure out, but I always felt like my best option was just to stay at distance when she did this attack to make the projectiles easier to avoid. Finally, she's got the cross slash, very similar to the second sentinel. I do like this move, but there are points where she'll just charge it up for ages and keep pressing towards you. A couple of times I found myself having to leap off the platform to avoid it, which isn't really a bad thing. I'm just not sure if it was entirely intended. I do really like Pinstress. It's definitely one that was enhanced by my devotion to the parry skill, but Silksong's boss roster reaches some incredible highs, and Pinstress just doesn't quite make it up to that level of competition. She's the gatekeeper for the high tier of Silksong's best bosses.
On my first couple of attempts at this boss, I really didn't enjoy it. I thought there was just way too much going on and didn't like the teleporting at all. But something clicked on my third. I got the rhythm of the fight down and managed to beat it. Once you really learn it, it becomes immensely fun. Her teleporting means you have to constantly be on the move and chasing her down, but not in a boring way like No Eyes. It actually enhances this fight. Her projectiles have set paths that are clearly telegraphed on screen, so there's no risk of misjudging their momentum as with Widow. Her melee attacks are both really solid, especially the diagonal double slash. Phase 2 amps it up with AoE orbs scattered around the arena, but it never leads to a situation where damage is impossible to avoid. This fight feels very similar to the encounter against Widow, but I just feel it's executed much better, so it gets a solid placement here. The Clover Dancers are a really solid boss and a cool extension of the earlier fight against the Cogwork Dancers. I'll touch more on the nitty gritty of what makes them work when I speak about their counterpart, but here I'd just like to explore why I think this fight isn't as good. Firstly, perhaps most significantly, you've already faced everything it has to offer. It does shake up the center screen AoE and force you to use a wall jump to evade it, but that doesn't massively change the style of the fight. Of course, there is the added challenge that only one of the enemies is vulnerable, the other not taking any damage, but still being able to dish it out. Unfortunately, I don't enjoy this as much as the gameplay of the Cogwork duo. I just find being able to hit them both much more fun. This fight also doesn't have the incredible phase 4, one of the best parts of the early fight, and the soundtrack, while a respectable remix, doesn't reach the highs of the original. I just think the first of these fights excels in all areas to a much greater degree, so it places higher on my list. I'm interested to learn what the community consensus ends up being though, as I can definitely see some people leaning towards the Clover Dancers for their higher level of difficulty. While it's not the traditional duel-style fight I'm so fond of, I rather enjoyed Silksong's final boss. The projectile needles are really well balanced and there's a lot of variety. The spikes that cover the ground later add a great new challenge to the fight. The melee slash is well designed, though I do think the tail could do with being a little clearer, since the white flash blends with the boss quite a lot. I don't think the falling stones were massively necessary, but they don't detract from the fight. The needles can also come from off screen and be difficult to see as such a void, but this is a very minor problem that doesn't come off often. My biggest issue with this boss isn't even its own fault, is the double jump. When she creates a giant web across the screen, it will often force you to jump and hover in the gaps, similar to in the earlier fight against the Cogwork Dancers. The issue is, you'll now likely have unlocked a double jump, which means you have to time it correctly rather than just hover. Failing to do so results in a significant punishment of 3 masks. It's a different kind of challenge, but as with the original Hollow Knight, there's a notable delay between the input and action of double jumping, so it doesn't feel the most responsive, and given how precise you need to be not to get clipped by the web, the player really needed the ability to move with more precision. It's the only gripe I have with the movement in this game, and it's hardly even a detriment to the fight. So why does it place so far from the top of my list? Well, despite not having many issues with the moves themselves, they aren't as interesting to interact with as the higher placing bosses. Furthermore, I don't love Grandmother Silk as the final boss of the game. I just feel it's far too similar in design to Radiance, and I was hoping they'd do something different. It's completely personal bias, and from this point on I can understand any boss being someone's favourite in the game. When Silksong is putting effort into creating unique bosses, they really do make some bangers. After suffering through that mini-boss in the cave before the Hunter's March, and the dreadful platforming that followed, my enjoyment of Silksong was fading fast. Finding the exploding lava slugs in that vertical room didn't help either. They're a terribly designed enemy. But thankfully, Lace was right there to restore it with an incredible boss fight, one of Hollow Knight's best. She has a great moveset with a lot of variety, and the potential to actually chain attacks together, being the dash attack into the melee combo. And I don't take issue with any of these moves, they're all immensely fun to engage with. You'd think I'd have an issue with the potential to fall off the edge of the arena into lava, but surprisingly, I don't. Do I think it was necessary? Not really. Would I remove it? Probably, but it's not a massive detriment. I really don't care that it's there. On top of the great gameplay is Lace's strong visual identity, which is only reinforced by being in an incredibly distinct area of fire and stone. I'd seen Lace prior to release and thought she looked cool, but I was really surprised at just how much I enjoyed this fight. Feels very similar to Orospina from Blasphemous 2. If you're after a boss that feels like it would fit right into Sekiro, Phantom will be right up your street. Once you get into the rhythm of dodging her attacks, it's so immensely satisfying. I can definitely see opinions on this boss being very divided, and that's due to the variance in the difficulty based on your playstyle. You cannot be overly aggressive with Phantom. She's way too punishing of making mistakes up close. You're at too much risk of having your attack parried and getting caught in a deadly flurry counter. I do appreciate that even if she parries you, it doesn't guarantee you get hit. The retaliation is perfectly avoidable, but this boss really pushes you to play patiently. Wait for her to use moves that give you the most optimal openings to counter, and only go for one attack at a time. She doesn't have the largest health pool, you're just limited in how often you're safe to attack. Silksong as a whole encourages this playstyle as is, so I had no issue adapting. She was definitely challenging, but once I figured her out, I didn't have too much issue. Generally, the spear throw will be your opportunity to react, whether it be dashing in and attacking, or backing off and healing. The lunging thrusts also allow you to get a hit in if you can jump over them. In phase 2, she can create pillars of light that fill the arena, a fun addition to spice up the mostly melee duel. Then her third phase introduces her ability to teleport, which I just know is going to be controversial, but I didn't take too much issue with it. Occasionally she would teleport on top of me and there would be no way to avoid the damage, which is bad design, but there is actually a slight visual cue, a puff of smoke before she appears, so the player does have time to react, as long as she doesn't just spawn on top of you, of course. It's a strong duel style fight with a pretty neat quick time event to cap it off. She's pretty closely tied with Lace for me, but I think the flow Phantom's fight has gives her a slight edge. After the really solid boss that is Lace, I was expecting the next few encounters to take a dip in quality. Boy was I wrong. Fourth Chorus does everything right. It only has 3 moves. It's very simple in concept. It has the sweep across the arena that can come from either side and must be jumped over. It has the slam that destroys part of the platform, rewarding positioning, and later it will rain fiery orbs from above, again rewarding positioning. Usually in these kinds of games, I'm not a fan of the player's freedom to move being restricted with small arenas, but it's this boss's greatest strength. It never feels unfair, since even when it destroys much of your platform, there's always enough space for you to dodge her attacks effectively. And in the back half of the fight, wing gusts are added to the side of the arena to encourage the use of your newest tool, the Drifter's Cloak. Even if you get into a really bad spot with lots of the platform destroyed, which leaves you room to survive as is, you can fall back on using the wing gusts. The method of damaging the boss is also excellent, forcing the player to be a more active participant in the fight by hitting a target that isn't on their level. Reminds me a lot of Blasphemous' Amanecidas, which are some of that game's best bosses. Overall, I just love everything about Fourth Chorus, and while it doesn't quite crack that true upper echelon, it's a superior encounter to 90% of video game boss fights. I'm pretty sure this will end up being the boss that tops a lot of other boss rankings for this game. It has the greatest deal of narrative significance, great mechanics, and spectacular visuals. I love it, but it's not perfect. First, the good. Her moveset is all amazing. The lateral triple slash gives you a great chance to pogo, but has deceptive range and can punish you heavily if you don't notice it coming. The thrust across the arena again offers a pogo opportunity, though becomes much more dangerous in phase 2 when she can chain multiple thrusts together. The jump into the air followed by a dive is likely her most deadly move, and I much prefer it in phase 2 when it leaves a couple of damage areas in its wake. The Raging Conchfly could have really learned from this move. The arena is probably the best the game has to offer. Fields of white flowers seem to always work. Look at Shakra and Garmond. I know they aren't flowers, but come on, it's the same idea. This rematch essentially just improves on the first fight in every way, makes it much harder and more complex. It's simply an improvement. Now let's discuss the bad. Don't get it twisted, they're all very minor issues. Mostly I think they revolve around one of my biggest issues in this game, 2-mass contact damage. While I don't hate the 2-mass damage for the most part, despite it being a little overused on regular enemies, losing 2 hearts for simply touching an enemy is incredibly obnoxious. It becomes a massive issue when you have enemies who move around very jankily and unpredictably, typically flying enemies like the Savage Beastfly or Growl, but Lace suffers a little too. She's incredibly mobile, and often her movements can be very inconsistent, resulting in the player getting clipped as she jumps into them. It's really annoying, but doesn't ruin the fight by any means. It also becomes an issue when you're in midair and she decides to jump into you, dealing 2 massive damage. Those are really my only problems, the unpredictable movements and jumping attack having potential to shred your health. It's not even really Lace's fault, it's a bad design decision that causes annoyance in every boss. I was determined to fight Lace using the parry skill since I found it so much fun to use, but I felt like this made the fight much harder since I never had enough Silk to heal. Not that the added difficulty was a bad thing, it still only took me around 15 attempts, and I enjoyed it far more than I would have had I not fought her as if I was playing Blasphemous or Nine Souls. Great boss all around. Few games have so many bosses in these upper tiers. It's fitting that the second Sentinel should be the second highest boss on the list. After suffering with the likes of Broodmother, Growl and Father of the Flame, the second Sentinel was a much needed reminder of how great this game's bosses are when they actually put some effort in. When they design a unique and distinct enemy to serve as a boss that functions as a boss on their own merits, they almost always do it well. When they make a boring main boss and dump some ads in to bolster the challenge and make it seem like a fleshed out fight, not so much. Thankfully, the second Sentinel is an excellent embodiment of the former. It serves as the ending to likely my favourite questline in the game, which sees you solving 3 bell puzzles to create a clockwork heart and revive the Sentinel. It adds a lot of weight to this fight, but what really brings it up is the mechanics, some excellent mechanics. I chose to use the parry skill for this fight, and it enhanced it so much. Her double thrust is an awesome move, the parry she steals from Lace even more so. You'll see in my footage I often get parried, then parried her counter attack and return my own, which was just so cool. Her diagonal dive is great, her mid-air spinning slash shakes up the pace of the fight. I don't love the crescent projectiles she unleashes, they're not a terrible attack, just one that can sometimes be awkward to avoid, and I do think the fight would have been better without it, but the fun I have with this encounter is near unparalleled. It truly draws out the strengths of Silksong's combat system to the highest degree, to the point I enjoy this gameplay loop as much as even Sekiro, which is immensely impressive. I do wish the arena could have been something more distinct since it's basically just a dimly lit room. Had the second Sentinel borne the level of spectacle associated with the 4th chorus, it likely could have cracked my top 20 video game bosses of all time. Wow. Just wow. I don't know where to start. Words can't capture the incredible fight that is the dancers. They execute on every element of boss design to perfection. Soundtrack, one of Hollow Knight's best. Visuals, so unique. Gameplay, the best part of the fight by far. It has 4 entire phases, each changing something slightly to spice up the fight. Its length makes it an endurance fight through and through, but you never get bored of engaging with these moves despite having to be so patient. You have to be keenly aware of the boss's patterns at all times or you'll get caught. But the rhythm of the fight is just so incredible, it never gets stale. I think that's what makes the gameplay stand out so much here. The rhythm of it. It has such a satisfying flow. It really does feel like you're part of a choreographed dance, almost like the parry counter loop of Sekiro, the game with the greatest combat of all time. They only have 3 attacks to throw at you, which is good considering how long the fight can last, but it's what they do with this simplicity that works so well. There's such vast variety in the directions of their dashes, and while I did notice a few predetermined sequences in the mix, they can seemingly go anywhere at any time, but it's somehow somehow manages to still be well balanced. They function almost like magnets, they always move in response to the other. Maybe that's a weird analogy, but I'm sure if you fought them, you understand what I'm getting at. This solves the biggest issue that plagues so many gank fights, being the boss's AIs not functioning well with one another, and leading to situations where the player cannot avoid damage. That's impossible here. There will always be plenty of safe places for you to stand. There's also the web-like frenzy of slashes that fills the screen, forcing you to find a gap and jump and hover within it to avoid them. It seamlessly makes use of all the techniques in Hornet's toolkit, and that's always a good thing. And the final attack, my favourite one, is where they come together in the centre of the screen and create an AoE of white slashes in the centre of the arena. It's honestly really easy to dodge and a great opportunity to get damage in, but will punish reckless players a great deal. But the reason I love it so much is how it presents lore through gameplay. So let's discuss the lore, the phenomenal, subtle lore. The dancers are mechanical creations of Farloom, designed as performance to welcome bugs to the Citadel, but their construction was so effective. They're such a perfect replication of life that they developed a soul. Not two souls, not one each, just one they share between them. And when we finish that third phase, cutting down one of the dancers, we shatter half that soul. The fourth phase ensues and we're compelled by our natural drive as gamers to mercilessly beat on this now virtually defenseless, broken half of a hull we destroyed. The score was already incredible, but here it transitions to a somber, despairing music box embodying the suffering of the surviving dancer. It's brutal, it's gut-wrenching, it's everything the lore of a video game boss should be. Personally, this scene resonated with me more than watching Sif limp around in Dark Souls, seeing the remaining dancer float to the centre of the screen, only to be unable to perform its attack without its other half, instead falling to its knees. Devastating. So yeah, this boss is truly something special. The design is one of the coolest and most unique I've seen in any game. The gameplay is stronger than nearly any other 2D boss. The lore is fantastic and actively plays a role in the mechanics of the fight. The cogwork dancers are simply perfect. Well, that was a long video, but there's every boss in Hollow Knight Silksong ranked from worst to best, in my personal opinion. Overall, I'm confident in saying it's a notable step up from the roster of the original, but making this ranking, it's become clear to me just how much of a mixed bag it is. Silksong reaches higher highs than almost any other game and has a high number of really good bosses, but then there's the other end of the spectrum with fights like Growl, Broodmother, and Savage Beastfly. I genuinely have no explanation as to how Team Cherry could make a masterpiece like the Cogwork Dancers, and then in the same game concoct the fight with Growl the Great. Do they actually understand what makes a good boss, or are their successes just luck? I don't have an answer for you, but I'm eager to hear your thoughts in the comments below. Remember that this is a subjective medium, so let's remain respectful in our discussion. I hope you've enjoyed this video, and I'm hugely grateful to those of you who watched all the way through. If you have, maybe consider sticking around. Maybe like and subscribe, perchance? Hopefully I'll see you in my next video.